Özkan-Haller, who I'm very pleased to welcome to UH Mānoa. I'm going to begin my introduction with a small anecdote. Last summer, I was at an international conference on chemistry, the Goldschmidt Conference, when I saw, frankly to my astonishment, that the topic of one of the plenary speakers was advancing diversity, inclusion, and social justices in science fields and academia. Most of us know that women are profoundly underrepresented in the STEM fields. But this is not something that is generally openly discussed, certainly not in an international meeting. The room was packed. This is progress, I thought. And the speaker was our guest today, Dr. Tuba Özkan-Haller. My first thought after leaving her plenary is that I had to find a way to bring her here to UH Mānoa to share some of her inspiring vision and accomplishments. With the help of the SOAS Dean, Brian Taylor, and a grant from the UH Seed Ideas program, we were able to bring Dr. Özkan-Haller in. And I wanted to take a moment to thank some people who've helped me as we've kind of geared up for this visit. It takes more than funding to put together a 3-day visit full of events. First of all, I want to thank Dr. Jennifer Ingalls of HIGP, who's now at Oregon State, who's partnered with me every step of the way. Daniela Botcher-Wilson of the Center for Teaching Excellence, who organizes these Visiting Scholar series, has provided enormous support. And you will have been given one of these surveys as you walked in the door. This is part of the CTE's mission, is to collect information on people who attend these events, and it's also part of my Seed Ideas grant. So if you would be so kind as to fill those in before you leave and leave them with the folks who will be collecting them, I would be grateful. I want to also thank the Oceanography Department Office, Marcy Grabowski of SOAS Communications, and many of the women in SOAS and the SOAS students for ideas and support. And I want to call out, in particular, Anamika Betty De Silva and Gabby Weiss of the SAS, the SOAS students, who have provided enormous help. Finally, I want to acknowledge Provost Michael Bruno for his support. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tuba Özkan-Haller. She is Associate Vice President for Research, Administration, and Development at the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences at OSU. She's also a professor holding joint appointments in both COs and the School of Engineering. She is a PI on an NSF Advanced Grant, which you'll be hearing more about, which she has used to bring about enhanced understanding to her institution about the barriers that women face in the STEM fields, and start to approach ways in which these barriers can be lowered and hopefully one day made to disappear. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tuba Özkan-Haller.
Thank you, Kathleen, for this very kind introduction, and thank you all for being here today. I am just thrilled with the diversity of faces in this room, and really thrilled that you all want to participate in this conversation. So as Kathleen said, I'm coming here from Oregon State University, where we've had an Oregon State Advanced Grant. So this is a National Science Foundation 5-year grant that is now coming to a close. So I'll tell you a lot about the kinds of activities we engaged in as part of that grant, and I have to, of course, thank my co-PIs, whose names I've listed here. OSU also has a number of other programs from which I borrowed for this talk, including a search advocacy program, a social justice education program, as well as an Office of Institutional Diversity who run a bias incident intervention program. And you'll hear more about all of these ideas and programs as we go along the 3-day visit here. Okay, but before I go there, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about myself. 3/4 of the time, I am an Associate Vice President within the Research Office at Oregon State University. The other quarter of my time, I am still a faculty member and a scholar, because you've got to feed your soul, right? And as a faculty member and scholar, I engage in work to try to understand the nearshore ocean. We're really trying to work towards a predictive understanding. And I like to engage in work that is sort of at the creases between disciplines. So I do some computer science type work, machine learning, married together with physics-based models to see if we can correct model errors. We do things like pull data assimilation methods in, where models and data can be combined for a better estimate. And if you're interested in the kind of work that I do with my research hat on, there will be a talk on Thursday. Please do come. I love talking about my research, so I couldn't pass up the opportunity to do a little plug. I'm also a big believer in engaged research and also in ways of involving stakeholders and communities who can benefit from this understanding into the process from the get-go. Really enjoy interacting with students as well. And I'm telling you all of this, I guess, because I'm trying to convince you that I am not an outsider coming in and talking about our profession. This is my profession. I love being an academic. I love being a scholar and a scientist. But I also know that I can critically look at my profession and see things that we could be doing better. And I invite you to do the same thing today. I invite you to be curious. I invite you to be non-judgmental, and I invite you to not be defensive. Because, you know, we're sort of all amongst ourselves here, and we can think critically about our profession. And if I think critically about my profession, one of the first things that I notice is that academia has a problem. Academia is one of the least diverse disciplines or least diverse professions around, really. And there must be reasons for that. And I'm going to argue that we're not very diverse when it comes to people. So as far as folks from, you know, gender, race, physical ability, gender identity, sexual orientation, so folks with all of these differing gender identities and personal identities are not necessarily represented in academia. But I'm also going to argue that there are more ways in which we are not diverse. I'm going to argue that we're not very diverse as far as the methods we use are concerned, or the impacts, the ways in which we measure the impact of our work. This talk primarily really will be about the first item here, but towards the end I'm going to try to broaden our view a little bit and encourage us to think even more broadly about how we can shape our profession. All right, so I'm going to have some starting assumptions here, and this is really important. Starting assumption, people of differing gender, race, gender identity, you name it, are equally capable of being successful in academia. That is a starting assumption. This seems like a pretty obvious statement, right? Of course, all of us, when we look at the statement, would believe this to be true. But then, you know, if you look critically in the ways in which we do our work, for instance, if we look at plenary speakers and conferences, or who gets the oral presentations versus the poster presentations. If we look at publications that are in like Nature or Science, you know, who are the lead authors of those things? Teaching evaluations, who comes out to be the better teacher, and if you parse that by gender or sexual orientation, for instance. Or the next time you have a panel. You know, quite recently, I had a conversation with a colleague of mine when I noticed an issue of Nature, and it looked like women were really grossly underrepresented in the list of first authors. Well, my colleague said, well, you know, maybe their science isn't just as good. That's why. We talked about that for a little bit. Then he said, well, maybe their science is just as good, because remember, we are believing that everybody is as capable. Then he said, well, maybe they're just not brave enough. You know, it takes a little bit of bravery to put your paper into Nature. We're not going to say that. We're not going to say women are not brave enough as far as this talk is concerned. Panel speakers, here's another one. You know, if you find yourself with an all-male panel and you haven't even noticed, there's actually, if you haven't been there, all-male panels, that kind of hilarious thing. Okay, so when we see that women or other underrepresented groups are underrepresented, we're not going to assume because there's less of them. We're not going to assume that they are less capable. We're not going to assume that they are just not trying. The moment we take those things away and the gender disparity still exists, then we have to ask ourselves, well, what else is going on? There are women out there, they're capable, they're doing good work, how come they're not represented? That's when we really start getting at the heart of the matter. And I'll try to communicate this to you with a cartoon. Here I have a number of blue dots and a number of red dots, and they're supposed to indicate a pool of qualified faculty, men, women. Now, this is a bit problematic that I divided them up like this, men, women. We'll talk about this a little bit more in just a few minutes, but just bear with me for a second. Let's say that these are all the qualified candidates, and that the most qualified candidates are the dots on top, okay? So what are the kinds of barriers that women are experiencing? For a while now, we have known that implicit bias is a really important barrier. Cognitive bias, implicit bias really factors into search processes and promotion processes. So They affect women disproportionately. Lack of access to informal mentoring networks, as it turns out, this is one of the most important things that women don't get access to. And this, of course, causes them to drop out. What else do we have? School and college resources, what kind of college resources are available, are not necessarily communicated straightforwardly. They tend to have a larger service role. We know this has been documented. Then there's a lot of interactional issues that come up. Passive-aggressive behavior towards women, microaggressions. This is really the next forefront. There's a lot of work now being done in the social sciences around the effects of microaggressions. Horizontal aggression, if you don't know what that is, later ask me a question about it. Sexual harassment, of course, is an issue, and if you all have not read the National Academy's report on sexual harassment, I really encourage you to read it. And don't just read the executive summary. There's a lot of really good, meaty information in the interior of the report, so I really encourage you to look at it. And one of the things they talk about is the term gender harassment, that it's really like an iceberg, and sort of the overt sexual harassment that is actually relatively rare is sort of the top of the iceberg. But below, underneath the surface of the water, are a lot of behaviors that are in aggregate very, very harmful psychologically that we don't necessarily talk about, and this report really points them out. What else? Lack of family-related policies affect women disproportionately, lack of dual career policies, but of course they affect men too, which is why I'm making some of the blue dots disappear here as we go. P&T processes, again, very porous to implicit bias and other kinds of lack of equitable reward structures. In the end, all of these things work together to end up with a picture like this. These dots, this is about 20% representation. That's about what it is within STEM disciplines in this country. Enter National Science Foundation Advance. The Advance program has existed for a little over a decade now, and they fund what they're calling institutional transformation grants. Even though they're called institutional transformation, NSF really wants us to work on gender, so women, and they want us to work on STEM disciplines in particular, where the underrepresentation of women is very severe. Now, we took that mission and really broadened it a little bit. So the proposal for Oregon State Advance was written over 5 years ago now, and we explicitly did a few things. One, we broadened the vision. We wanted to move past just diversity. We want to move past numbers. It's not enough to get women in the door. It also matters how they experience the institution once they are here. Do they feel like they're being treated justly? Second, we wanted to move beyond monolithic gender, because if we always parse the data by men and women, white women, tend to be the majority of the women at the institution, we're really only hearing the story of white women. We're not necessarily hearing the story of women of color. So we need to engage in this concept that's called intersectionality. And then finally, we want to move beyond barriers. Again, when we parse the data by men and women, folks who are gender non-conforming, their story gets lost completely. So we'd like to look beyond gender binaries. Many of the advanced grants up until this point had been around interventions that basically targeted the underrepresented groups, providing them with, say, mentoring opportunities because they're not getting access to the informal mentoring that folks from the dominant culture have access to. And this is all well and good. We definitely need programs like that that provide the support that folks need at the level that they need it at. But we thought what we wanted to do is gear our intervention towards the folks within the institution who actually have the power to change institutional policies and practices. And those are folks in upper administration. Those are very influential, full professors. So we geared our intervention towards the people who have power, rather than the people who are from underrepresented groups. We did not provide them with a rule book. One of the first things that folks ask me when we're doing this work, and I'll tell you more about how we do this work, give me the 3 best practices. That's like saying, I just realized I have cancer, can you please give me the one pill that when I take it once will cure me? Right? It doesn't work like that. We're really looking for people to have a much deeper understanding of the issues so that they don't need a rule book, so that they can make things up as they go, make up the solutions that their community needs, their unit needs. And then finally, this isn't just a regular NSF grant, right? 5 co-PIs put a grant together, and usually when 5 PIs get a multi-million-dollar grant, you clap, you go do your work now, publish. That's not what this is. 5 people cannot transform an institution. So the entirety of the institution has to be behind this work. And really what the 5 PIs are doing is playing a catalyzing role. All right, so we see ourselves as a catalyst. We are interested in equity, inclusion, and justice. And we do this work at 3 levels of influence. And I'll tell you what these 3 levels are. The personal level, the symbolic level, and the institutional. And I'll already give you a preview. The symbolic and the institutional are very, very important. And I'll tell you why. But before I do, the institutional context here is really important. There's a lot of work on change models that show that if you embed a change model in the existing culture of an institution, you are much more likely to be successful. And that is what we did. In our culture, in the 1990s, OSU formed a program called the Difference, Power, and Discrimination Program. This was in reaction to some very racist incidents that happened on campus. And what this program is every undergraduate student as part of their baccalaureate core has to take 1 course that deals with issues of difference, power, and discrimination. Now, when the program was put into place, very quickly it became obvious that there were not enough faculty members who knew enough about issues of difference, power, and discrimination to teach these courses. So the program was put into place to train faculty so that they can incorporate this material into their classes. And that training, the Difference, Power, and Discrimination Curricular Transformation Program, took hold at the university, and many faculty would take a 2-week immersion program during which they would basically create a class with a syllabus that incorporated these concepts. Not very many STEM faculty engaged in this 2-week seminar, as you can imagine, but there was a long-standing tradition of this immersion program where at the end you come out with a product. So we modeled our advanced seminar after that. It's a 2-week immersion program. It's not geared towards curricular transformation. Instead, it's geared towards institutional policies and practices. And we get 15 people into a room and have them think for 2 weeks very, very deeply about what policies and practices form barriers and what we can do to change them. Okay, so these 3 dimensions that I talked about, the individual, symbolic, and institutional, this concept is all part of a theory called the Systems of Oppression Theory that was put forward by Patricia Hill Collins in 1993. And there's a whole literature, scholarly literature about this concept and about the concept of critical race theory, for instance. If you haven't read up on this work, it's very enlightening. The work talks about 3 reciprocally determined and inter-influential dimensions. And it also talks about how changing individual opinion about gender, race, you name it, doesn't necessarily change the symbolic and the institutional dimensions. So the structured issues continue on, even though the people who are functioning within those structures have changed their minds about things. So addressing the individual dimension isn't enough, and there's a lot of research that shows that changing people's minds isn't enough. We really have to address the institutional structures within which we operate. Right, so here is the 60-hour immersion program. So we engage in intersectionality because not every woman experiences academia in the same way. A white woman experiences academic structures very differently than a woman of color, for instance. We ask our participants to engage in personal reflection because, again, the way we view the world is very much grounded in who we are, our social identity. So it's important to understand more how our experiences are different from the experiences of somebody else. So that when I say something like, oh, that wouldn't bother me, that doesn't necessarily say it shouldn't or wouldn't bother somebody else, because my social positioning is so instrumental in the way I see the world. So we challenge our participants to examine policies, practices, norms, beliefs within the institution. And so one of the kinds of exercises that we might do might be something like this. So here we have all the social identity categories, well, not all, but some: race, sex, gender, religious affiliation, etc. And here I put some examples of the social groups that exist within those categories. Now, I want you to just do this mentally in your head. The intersectionality here becomes important because, again, not every person who is white has the same gender, religion, ability, socioeconomic status, age, etc. And how you view the world or how the world treats you is really at the intersection of all of these things. So think about that for a second. For all of these categories, mentally kind of pick out the one that you think you would belong to. Make a mental list, or you can even jot it down quickly on a piece of paper if you wish. And then what I want you to do is rank them. I want you to rank them in order of importance to you. So list at the very top whatever category you picked that is most important to you. I'll give you just a little bit of time to think about that. Some people find this ranking exercise really difficult. What do you mean? I can't rank them. I'm already seeing some brows that are like, try it. Try picking the one that is most important to you. Here's what you might find out. There is something that I'm going to call the dominant culture box. The dominant culture box for academia starts out something like this. Most professors are white. Most of them are male, especially in STEM disciplines. Most of them are straight. Most of them are married. I can continue on with this list, right? Pick out the categories pick out the social groups for all of those categories. Now, all of these attributes, there is no one person who actually personifies them all. This box isn't a person, right? This is just a dominant culture box. Now, no one person fits in there completely. But those of you who have an affiliation that doesn't fit within the social within this dominant culture box. Say you're a person of color. It's highly likely that you listed that as one of the most important things as when I asked you to rank. And those of you who have a lot of attributes who fit within the dominant culture box may have been the people who are having a little bit of trouble ranking them. And it's because every attribute that's within the dominant culture box brings us privilege. And that privilege is invisible to us. And it is only those things that are not within the dominant culture box, they really define the way the world treats us. And that's why we rank them higher. I rank being a woman really highly because that defines the way in which I experience and go through the world. And so this is an important concept. And again, this is not one given person. It really is the way in which our culture or our society is structured. And so the dominant culture, if you ask me to define it, would be in a diverse society, the group that holds social, economic, political power. And power here is really the important word. Without considering power, we really cannot understand the way in which our institutions are continuing on this cycle of underrepresentation. And social justice, we define that as a moral balance and fairness in terms of the location and access of wealth, of opportunities, of privileges, access to all of those things. Okay, so it's important to understand more about our individual positioning within this institution. But like I said before, just figuring out what that is or understanding ourselves a little bit better doesn't actually fix any problems. We need to go beyond that. We need to go into the symbolic and institutional dimensions. The symbolic dimension is often one that especially STEM people have a lot of trouble with. And it's because we tend to think we're sort of like cerebral walking heads and that, everything is 2 + 2 is 4. But as it turns out, we engage in a lot of symbolic communication. This is the way we pass our implicit biases on to our children, mostly through symbolic communication. And so within the advanced seminar, we do a lot of image analysis. We do a lot of analysis of symbolic communication. The 60-hour seminar, by the way, you're thinking to yourself, how does the hours add up? We do it 6 hours a day, 9 to noon. Everyone gets the lunch hour free. We provide the food. And then again from 1 to 4, 6 hours a day for 9 days. Folks get a long weekend in between. It is co-facilitated by 2 individuals, one who has a social science background, who really is well-versed, whose scholarship is around the theories of systems of oppression and critical race theory. And then the second person is usually somebody from a STEM discipline so that they can do a bit of translating, if you will, when the scholar just gets going too fast. And we've offered 9 summer seminars so far, and I've co-facilitated 2 of them as the STEM person. And I will admit to you that it is one of the most difficult, both times, it was one of the most difficult 2 weeks of my professional life. It's a very, very difficult subject to engage in, and having to do it day after day after day. But I'll tell you about what the immersion program really brings that otherwise I think you wouldn't have attained. But one of the things, we spent a lot of time in the symbolic dimension really discussing this. And one of the ways we do this is by looking at images. This is an example, for instance. This is a cover from Vogue magazine in April 2008. And Vogue magazine was actually quite proud of the fact that they were featuring a black man on their cover. But this drew a lot of criticism. This drew a lot of criticism from the black audience. And at first, think about it. Like, some of you immediately get it, others are like, But when you all are looking at this image, I mean, many of you are feeling sort of a slight sense of discomfort, right? And that's actually by design, right? Whoever picked this picture and put it on the cover, you're at the airport, you're perusing through magazines. Which one are you going to buy? This one might be one where you stop for a split second. And if you stop for a split second, you might actually pick it up. But that slight level of discomfort that the marketing people here are taking advantage of comes at a cost. It's actually communicating something. And people realize it once I start showing them pictures like this. Okay, this is from World War II. Here it says Kultur in German and list. So in this case here, the beast is representing the Germans, and the white woman is representing the Statue of Liberty. And then, of course, there's images of King Kong. But what this is doing is this is essentially making a connection in our implicit mind. And it is connecting somehow, it is perpetuating this notion that the black man is a beast who's out to get our white women, right? That's the cost that it comes up with. Yes, it sells a magazine, but at a pretty high cost. Here's an image that's to the scientists and engineers in the audience, maybe is closer. So this is the cover of Science Magazine, 2014, and the cover article was about HIV and trans sex workers. And the way this image is set, the way the lighting, one of the seminars that we did, we actually had a photographer, and he spelled out every single way in which this image basically draws attention to the part of the body of trans people that we think about, and we basically always ask questions about and violate their privacy about most, right? And trans people really react to this. They're really unhappy about this cover, and Science Magazine did issue an apology. And I could go on and on. Here's another example. This is a Paris soap commercial, ad from 1763. And so what is this communicating? This is communicating that with soap, somehow the person of color here is dirty, and that if you have the right soap, you can make them clean, right? And you're going to say, oh, come on, Tuba, you're really giving us an example from 1763? Well, here's another one for you from 2017. Dove soap. Right? So this stuff hasn't gone away. And unless we pay attention to the symbolic dimension, it's not going to go away, and it's going to continue to communicate to our children what we really don't want to communicate any longer. So there, the symbolic dimension, very important. The institutional dimension, perhaps the most important. There are many ways in which, many examples in our culture where the institutional dimension really continues to propagate differences that, as individuals, we no longer want to see propagated. And I'm going to give you an example. There are many institutional structures that we could draw from, especially when you look at the history in the U.S. of race relations. How many of you know what redlining was? Okay. Maybe a third of the audience has heard of it before. So redlining, and this is an example that we give because this was something that in Oregon is very white by design, and redlining is very much a practice. So what you do here is you basically say, if the family of color wants to move into a neighborhood, they can only get support, from financing if they move into a certain portion of town. That's the only way that they can get a mortgage. So now what you're doing is you're segregating folks into that area. And once you have a predominantly, black area, for instance, well, the white folks don't necessarily want to move there, and next thing you know, you've segregated your cities. Now, the other piece that factors into this is schools are funded in the US by property taxes. So what does this mean? Property taxes are driven by supply and demand. So where people want to live more, house prices are higher there, property taxes are higher there. Well, if you've got a segregated place and the majority of the folks are white, well, the majority of the folks, there's going to be a neighborhood that they don't want to live in. So naturally now, what you're doing is you're separating the quality of the schools in the particular neighborhoods. So these two practices combined, I'm going to argue actually schools being funded by property taxes by itself does this too, ends up with the end effect that schools in ethnic neighborhoods are poor. And if that's the case, then we have an education gap. With an education gap, we have a wealth gap, which means poor upward mobility, which means when decisions are being made about how schools should be funded, guess who's not at the table? The people who are being disadvantaged by that policy are not at the table. So schools funded by property taxes hasn't changed, right? So this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's a cycle that will continue. And it doesn't matter if the individuals who are living in that city, now that redlining is outlawed, it doesn't really matter whether or not the individuals believe that they are racist or not. They're functioning within a cycle here that is perpetuating racism, whether the individuals want it or not. So it's not until we engage to break that cycle that we really can make progress. Okay, so how are we going to break that cycle, and what does that cycle look like in academia? What are the kinds of processes that we think might actually be perpetuating things as they are? Well, graduate student admission policies, for instance. Let's think about them for a second. We already know that GREs, and we use GREs heavily to admit graduate students. GREs are an ethnic filter. We know this for a fact. There's lots of research that shows this. Okay, so what that means is we're using something, it's a numeric value, it's easy to use, but we know that it filters out people of color. And there is very little connection of GRE scores to actual ultimate success in the profession. We still use it. So that could be the number one thing we could immediately start working on. What other ways are there? Same thing with postdoc hiring practices. Faculty hiring practices, usually the practices that we use are very porous to implicit bias. So how can we design the process so that it's impervious to implicit bias? That's doable. Practices around access to information. What level of transparency are we happy with? Promotion policies, this is a really important one. Tenure processes, of course, that's the key. So we ask our participants in the advanced seminar day after day to think about ways, actions that they can take. And every time we cover these, we're really into, we're doing a lot less talking to than I am to you today. We try to get folks to really discover this information together, because when we discover and learn actively, we retain information better. So we do this through group discussions. We do a lot of embodied learning, because again, we carry this stuff in our bodies. We're not just walking heads. We're not just cerebral. We talk about a lot of case studies. And I will tell you, faculty, of course, are traditionally educated, right? They like being talked to. And sometimes we get the thing where, instead of doing the activity, can you just tell me what I would learn if I did the activity? No, you gotta do the activity. So there's definitely some resistance, but by the end of the first week, people understand, okay, I understand what we're doing here. The one other thing that we really engage them in are these action plans. Because again, we don't just want them to walk out better enlightened. We want them to walk out with the list of items that they're going to work on. And we encourage them heavily. Sometimes when they first come up with their action plans, and I have this, the action plan item number 1, the president should do X, Y, Z. Like, wait, that's not your circle of influence. You can't make the president do X, Y, Z. We really encourage folks to work within their circle of influence. And this becomes key. Because if you don't work within your circle of influence, the end result is frustration. And every one of us has a circle of influence. So as you're thinking about these matters, as you're thinking about what could I be doing, how can I be contributing, think about your circle of influence. Some are bigger, some are small, we all have them. So we ask them how they're going to make progress, we ask them what kinds of resources they need. So every day they work on these action plans, and towards the end they present them to each other so that they can critique them, and in the end we walk out with these action plans for everybody. And then of course we follow up with them. Because again, once you return to your everyday life, it's very easy for this work to sort of drop off. And I'll tell you, other ways in which we can prevent that. But one way to prevent that is accountability. So we follow up with them, we get the cohorts together, talking to each other, what works, what doesn't work, where are the difficulties, etc. So this catalyzing then, we think that there's three pieces to it that are really important. You have to move faculty and administrators to actively identify problematic policies and practices within their own units. And as it turns out, different colleges have different problems, so there really is no one-size-fits-all here. We then support them, and then we help them to move the work forward with regular check-ins. So what kind of work, what kind of impact has this work had so far? And I'll discuss the impact again in the three dimensions, in the individual dimension, the symbolic dimension, and the institutional dimension. Our president, our provost participated. We've had 3 provosts in the 5 years. All 3 have participated. And our president has been very positive about it. Here I have paraphrased one of our provosts. The first week was about attaining an intellectual understanding. I understand it now, I get it. But the second week is about an intuitive emotional understanding. I don't need to be told anymore, I feel it. And that really is the really powerful step. And then here I will have a couple more, whenever I feel like, oh, I can't go anymore, I can go and read some of these and then I feel better. Our NSF 3-year review was also very positive. They talked to us, very powerful, transformational, eye-opening, and again, these are from the individual dimensions, some great feedback, but it's not enough. We really need to work on the symbolic and the institutional. The symbolic, OSU had some very serious problems. Here was, for instance, a minute, our Oregon with a Native American chief in the picture. This is very problematic and drew a lot of criticism from the Native American community in Oregon. But this was the kind of campaigns we were running before. Here too, we were basically running campaigns that were, using stereotypes of men being solution seekers and women being different people. Now, we're doing campaigns that are very different. We have a brand new logo, brand new branding. Everything has been essentially been recreated since then. The institutional is probably the most important one, and I'll give you some examples from 2 colleges. One college that engaged very proactively has been the College of Engineering, and they identified that their hiring practices were not conducive to hiring diverse faculty. And they made some significant and very specific changes to their hiring practices. We already have a search advocate program at OSU, so a search advocate, a person who knows about cognitive bias and how it seeps into search processes, comes in and, in the beginning it used to be they just come and talk to you for a half an hour. And then it became, no, maybe they should stay for every meeting. Now, what the College of Engineering did is they asked every search chair, the chair of each search, to also be search advocate trained, and that really transformed things. Because now the search advocate actually can talk to the chair in the same language, and the chair is much more receptive to their comments. And the outcome was that in the last 3 years since they made these changes, over 50% of the people that they're hiring have been women. That's a really stark, pretty stark change. And what that's done for our College of Engineering is the numbers of women have risen from 15% to 25% over the course of 3 years. And it doesn't seem like a big jump, but for a land-grant institution, if you compare us to all of the College of Engineering school, the colleges of engineering within land-grant universities, we were in 15th place, and we were tied with 11 other institutions, and we're now in 2nd place. It does propel you. College of Ag Sciences took a totally different approach. They found that not all faculty were contributing to the work towards diversity and inclusion, that it was only a select few faculty, and they found that that was not acceptable. It's not until everybody participates that we really start valuing this work and how difficult it is. And so they put into everybody's position description that a certain percentage of their time had to be spent working towards diversity and inclusion. And one other thing that helped them is OSU went through their criteria for promotion and tenure, and in our institution, the Faculty Senate owns the faculty handbook, so the Faculty Senate can make changes. And they added language that said that all faculty members are responsible for ensuring diversity goals. So everybody had to do work, and this had to be documented in the promotion and tenure dossiers. And this isn't like a fourth thing that we do, right? It's not like now we're going to do research, teaching, service, and diversity. No. The idea here is that the work towards diversity and inclusion can be infused into all parts of your job, into your research, into your teaching for sure, into your service if you wish. But it's not just service. And some faculty got confused, like how do we do this? And we started, Advance was really proactive in providing examples, and here I've done some. NSF projects require broader impacts. They can, instead of going to K through 12 schools, maybe you can think about going to a school with an indigenous population. Inclusive classroom practices are huge. We had a speak out where students of color in 2015 talked to the faculty about how non-inclusive the classroom practices of their instructors were. Remember, these are students who are taking as part of their backboard a difference, power, discrimination course, right? These students know a lot more than the faculty do who are in front of them. And that's kind of saddening. So faculty need to know a lot more about inclusive practices. And how to set up a lab culture, how to take folks into the field and ensure that there's no gender harassment going on. And of course, service too. That probably is the easy place where you can insert this work. But, and this is where the kicker is, if we're going to do this work, if we're going to insert work around diversity and inclusion, social justice into all aspects of what we do, shouldn't we be rewarded for it? Right? When it comes to promotion and tenure time, that stuff shouldn't be just pushed aside. Right? There should be metrics that measure that work. And right now, they're not. Now, the other thing is OSU could change their promotion and tenure guidelines, but doing this one institution at a time isn't going to work either. Because again, when we're going up for promotion and tenure, we send letters out to other institutions and we say, would this person make tenure at your institution? And we don't necessarily communicate how in our institution we have this expectation towards work. So we can't do this one institution at a time. We need to do this as a community, as a profession. And this is really where I want to broaden the discussion a little bit. So we say we value work for diversity, inclusion, and justice. When somebody does that kind of work, we pat them on the back, maybe we give them an award. But when it comes to time for promotion and tenure, we brush all of that aside and we look at number of papers and classes, E-sets, and right, we go back to those sort of traditional metrics that we've been using forever. Well, I'm going to advocate that needs to stop. If we really value this work, then we have to value it when it matters. I think this comes up in other arenas too, though. One other arena comes out, a couple of years ago, right after the presidential election, I went to an American Geophysical Union conference, and there was a lunchtime panel discussion about how important it was to communicate the importance of science to the public, to policymakers, to politicians. And there too, we have some folks who are really good at communicating science to folks who are not scientists. But when they go up to promotion and tenure, do we consider that? Not so much, right? Again, if we value it, we have to consider it when it matters. The third piece, and I know some fields are really good at this, curating data. My field is not. More and more journals are now using the stick. They're requiring, if you want to publish in my journal, you have to curate your data. And most people I know, quite honestly, do the minimum possible, because again, are you going to spend your time writing your next paper that will be used to evaluate you for promotion, or are you going to spend your time curating your data set and making it available to the world? I'm going to write that paper, because that's what I'm evaluated on. Right? Whereas really curating that data set could propel, right? If people could do metadata analysis around the world, that could really be huge. I know the geophysics community is really good at it, but mine is not. But again, important, but not really valued. So these are all seemingly desired things that we would like faculty members not to do in addition to what they're doing, but to do while they're doing their work. But they're minimally or not at all included in promotion and tenure processes. So how do we change that? I think this is within my very, very personal view. I think faculty members do two things. Faculty members at research-intensive universities. We generate new knowledge, and then we communicate that new knowledge. That's really what we do. And that communication can be to the public, to politicians, it can be to students. It can be to communities who can benefit from that understanding. We create new knowledge, ideally maybe even co-develop new knowledge with those communities, and then we communicate it. And that should be what we get evaluated on. But we do this, we have to do this while also making sure that we contribute to diversity and inclusion, making sure that we increase science literacy, because quite frankly, with the second bullet, I think our profession is on the line here if we don't do this. And right now, the people who are really good at this, we're weeding them out. And maybe it's boundary organizations through which we do this, but again, we have to value the work of interfacing with them. And then increasing access to data and products. So I think it really is time to let go of our multi-hundred-year-old evaluation system. And I'm not saying let's do away with tenure. What I'm saying is let's revamp it, let's modernize it. Let's make sure that what we say we value actually aligns with how we evaluate people. That's where that broadening is. Because as long as we don't do that, then trying to move these questions of diversity and inclusivity forward will feel like pushing rocks up hills. Right? But if we do that, it might look something like this. Right? Making change might actually be a lot easier and more people would engage. And in the work that we did for Oregon State Advance, what we found is that we had to do a lot of out-of-the-box thinking. We had to do a lot of work within our own circle of influence. The 5 co-PIs can't change the institution. We had to make sure other people became engaged, so who had the power to change the institution. We found that we had to look at it holistically at institutional barriers, and that they were not the same within different units within the university. We found that we needed to have a conversation about the profession. There are ways in which our profession is set up that in and of itself forms barrier to making progress on this work. And I personally think professional societies, national academies have a role to play here, and I hear the National Academy is actually starting to engage with this conversation. Now, before I end, let me stop with a plug, actually two. This is probably not enough advanced knowledge for many of you here, but we do now, as our last activity for Oregon State Advance, we will be running what we're calling a train-the-trainer program. Again, a 2-week immersion program where we cover some of the content that goes on in the 2 weeks. We can't cover all, but we also cover some content about how to actually facilitate these conversations, especially for people from science and technology backgrounds like me. It's a steep learning curve. We do encourage collaborative pairings of teams from different parts of the campus doing it together so that they can co-facilitate together. Co-facilitating with 2 people ends up being really key in my mind. So if you're interested in that, give me a call or you can look us up on our webpage. And the second plug I'll make is if some of you are engaging in scholarly work related to diversity and inclusion, one of the things that we had originally proposed, our lead PI did, was an advanced journal, an open access journal that we created, and SF was very, very excited about this, and our first issue just finally came out. And so it's a scientific journal, not a scientific, it's a scholarly journal where information about this work can be collected. All right, and with that, I'll leave you with my title slide, and I'm happy to entertain questions. I'm going to ask you to stand up, and Jenny's going to run over and sprint over to you and give you a microphone so everyone can hear.
Hi, Tuba. I'm Anamika Baby Silva. I noticed in your last slide you had a picture of the advanced group at OSU, and I didn't see any white men in that picture. I wanted to understand why, and maybe if having a white male in that picture would change things for the advanced group.
That's a really good observation and great question. Right, as you see, the group is made up of primarily women, and we also have Dwayne, who is awesome. So, naturally, I think that women tend to engage in this work of trying to increase the number of women in the discipline because they are, they have a lived experience of it, right? Now, when we put the team together, the PIs together, the advance is really a social science project, right? So it had to be led by social scientists, and the majority of our team are social scientists. We only have 2 folks from the natural sciences involved. So when we put the team together, it really clearly was like-minded people who've been thinking about these issues for quite a while. But again, the PIs are not the change makers in this case. The PIs are just facilitators. And if I put up a picture for you, and I know I did at one point put up a picture of one of our old corporate gatherings, the people who are doing the actual work are, do I not have a picture? Yes, I do, right? There we go. The people who are doing the actual work, you see how many, white men and white women are involved there. So expanding beyond the PI group was actually key. I think had we not done that, we could not have made the progress that we made.
Thanks for your talk. I was interested when you mentioned that you had a session where students of color were able to talk to faculty about their experience because they do actually know often more than the faculty. So I was wondering how you created a safe space where the students felt that they could be honest and talk about.
Right, so I should have been more clear. That was not Advance's work. The students actually stepped up by themselves. The students decided, we're sick of it, we're going to have a speak out. And they called up the president. Our role really was in making sure that people heard about it and making sure people showed up. There was about 500 faculty who were at the session. And the students deserve all of the credit. It was an incredibly difficult and brave thing for them to do. After the speak out, our president certainly became more interested in this work. So if anything, they helped us rather than the other way around. Their bravery helped us. And right after, when we had our open call for the advanced summer seminar, we have 30 slots, right? 2 seminars, 15 people each. We had 70 people self-nominate that year. Because again, I think it really gave faculty the understanding, oh my God, I'm clueless. I do not know what I'm doing wrong. Might I be doing things in the classroom that are not inclusive without realizing? I don't want to be that person. So it really catalyzed people, students speaking up in a collective voice. There's a lot of power to that.
And so the faculty were open to hearing the students. They weren't like, they didn't, they weren't defensive.
So the way it was set up is it was really a speak out in the sense that the faculty were not speaking. There was no engagement. They were just listening. Now, were some people thought, yes, and so often, that's why when I started this talk, I talked about this, let's try to be curious and not defensive. Because the moment we switch into, well, I didn't mean that, the defensive position, that's the moment where we stop making progress. And it is really difficult to, well, I didn't, your intent really doesn't matter. The impact is what matters. And sure, you didn't mean it, but it still happened. So that taking that out, listen, the impact is there, and trying to keep people from being defensive. And during the advanced seminar, this happens too. We have to really control that dynamic and make sure that people continue to operate out of a position of compassion, realizing that, our lenses are soldered onto our faces. We see the world through them. We can't take them off and put somebody else's lens on. All we can do is believe their experience and not get defensive. Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. This is a question about your immersion programs. You say you're having a last one where you're training the trainers.
Mm-hmm.
I assume that has to do with the fact that the grant funding is gone. So does that mean that there has not been an institutional commitment to keeping this going in the future or helping train other trainers in the future for other institutions?
Thank you for that question. So one of the things that NSF Advanced talks about right away, even during the proposal writing process, is the sustainability plan. And to tell you the truth, our sustainability plan had some twists and turns because, again, we had 3 provosts during the 5 years, and every provost, of course, comes with a set of priorities where they want to put their resources. But I'm happy to report that there's right now an open position for an advanced director position that will live within the provost office. It is funded at a level that is less than what we would have desired, but that in the budget crunch times maybe is not that strange. There will be an advanced director, there will be one summer seminar per summer rather than 2. But again, we've already put 135 high-level faculty through it, but you know, there's always turnover with new people coming in. So the grant is going to do a train the trainer, partially because we want to make sure at OSU too, there are enough folks who can continue to deliver this material year after year. And we like the idea that we're going to have new leadership because the 5 of us co-PIs, we've given it all we've got, and it's really ready for some new vision and new points of view. But yes, there will be an Oregon State Advance office.
Thank you, Tuba. It's very impressive. Congratulations on all your success. I'm interested in the tenure promotion process and the inclusion of aspects of diversity, inclusion in all aspects of the work, all 3, as you said. How hard was that to do?
It's pretty hard. And the reason why it's hard is because we have to come up with ways to measure it, right? And so, because this is broader than just diversity, so one other aspect of that is, for instance, work towards innovation, entrepreneurship is also not valued at my institution. Other institutions are doing a better job. But NSF has now funded us to carry out a workshop. It's specifically catered towards innovation and entrepreneurship because it's coming from that side of NSF. But during this workshop, the idea is to work on ways to measure success. What does success look like? If we could have a similar workshop, how do you measure effective work towards diversity and inclusion by individuals? That's really the key. I mean, the reason why we still continue to use GREs for student admission is because it's a number, it's easy to do, so we need to come up with metrics. And again, I don't know the answer to these, and the answer is something that we have to co-create. This is why I think the National Academies is really important, because creating different metrics by different institutions is going to get really confusing. We need to do this as a profession rather than one campus at a time, which is why I keep going from campus to campus to campus and telling the same story.
Thank you for that great talk, Tuba. My question has to do with how do you content as faculty member and researcher already feeling overwhelmed by the number of things you're called on to do, yet this is something you care about and you want to see change and you want to invest yourself in it. It's just sometimes it seems like the parts add up to more than the whole. I just wonder, you clearly found a way. I just would like to hear your thoughts on that.
So my personal experience?
Sure, or however you want to answer it.
This is actually a little bit of a difficult question because I feel like my experience or the way I've gone about this isn't necessarily ideal. I've had an interest in this topic ever since graduate school. And when I was an assistant professor, I tried to engage pretty heavily in this work right away when I came to Oregon State University in particular. But it became obvious to me pretty quickly that if I did that I was never going to get promoted. That when the 6 years were over, I wasn't going to have enough papers. And so I did something that I wished I didn't have to do. I wished that the next generation doesn't have to do what I had to do. I put the work aside, right? I locked it up in a corner, and I did my research. Now, I love my research, so it's not like that's hard to do. But I also love this other work that I basically felt like I was being prevented to engage in because of the way the metrics were set up, the system was set up. I put it aside. And it wasn't until I could tell, so I did get promoted to associate professor, still didn't engage, and it wasn't until I could see that the promotion of full professor was in the bank that I started to engage. And we wrote the proposal the year before I was, when I was putting my dossier together, essentially, for the promotion of full professor. Because I feel like I see too many people out there who are associate professors who are great at communicating science, award winners on this panel, at EGU panel I was telling you about. The person who was the award-winning communicator was also the person who was an associate professor and had been for a while. So I put it aside for a while, and I worked to get the stature before I re-engaged. Now, I will tell you one more thing. Since then, the one piece of advice I was given by the NSF program manager of the advanced program is she said, you know, for the STEM people who do this work, it's a career killer. She told me this straight to my face. What do you mean? Well, you know, you're going to put all your time into this, you're not going to publish as many papers. And she said, what you have to do is in your own unit, you have to remain a scientist and only a scientist. So I put a lot of energy into continuing to publish papers, continuing to give, this is why I give a science talk every place that I go where I talk about advance, because I'm still a scholar. And I don't want to lose that, that credibility of being an active faculty member, because then I think that makes the work less effective. Not an ideal answer, but an honest one.
Thanks. So the research suggests that working groups that are more diverse can be more creative, bring more innovative solutions to given problems, and maybe even be more productive. Have you been able to show that to be the case at OSU in terms of publication rates from the engineering department? And could that, if so, could that be the metric that you're looking for to show the efficacy and self-interested nature of moving toward diversity? Or if it's not the case, do you think that would be because of these other external barriers to publication that you pointed out, and so you have to transform the whole journal publishing process before you'll be able to see that?
Yeah, we have not collected that data, so I do not know the answer to the question of whether or not productivity has increased because we have more diverse groups. One would think that, a lot of the work that we do that's evaluated in P&T's individual work, right? And so whereas that diverse group dynamic plays out more in interdisciplinary collaborative work, so we might have to parse the data accordingly. But the one other thing that you said when you started the question is you talked about ways in which diverse groups make us better. So that's a justification why we should be doing this work to begin with. And I don't know if you noticed, but I never justified why we should be doing this work. So thank you for that addition. Part of the reason I never justified it is because we ended up in the beginning of our program spending a lot of time sort of running on a treadmill, not going anywhere, trying to convince people that we should be doing this work. And at one point we decided we're not going to try to convince people, we're just going to tell them we got to do this work. It's because it is the morally right thing to do. Let's be honest. And here's what would happen, for instance. People would be like, can you show us data? Is there really a leaky pipeline? And okay, so we would show data on the national trends, and then they would be like, yeah, but that doesn't happen at our institution. So we would show them data from our institution, and then they would say, yeah, but that really doesn't happen in my unit. So we would show them data from their unit, and they would say, oh, those numbers are too small, you really can't make any sense. Right? So at some point, we turned the question around. We said, tell me a policy. Here's our hiring policy. Okay, show me how it doesn't form a barrier to underrepresented groups. Well, how am I going to do that? I don't know. Show me. Every policy is suspect unless it is proven that it is not forming a barrier to the participation of underrepresented groups. That's where we start.
Thank you. Wonderful talk. This is obviously something that's been around forever, and you've been working on this quite a long time. I'm wondering how in your workshops, how do you manage expectations? Because of course, when you start to engage in this, you say, all right, we want to see change now, and how do you manage that?
Yes, that's a really great question. So in reality, change, especially cultural change, is very slow. Culture change is a very, very slow process. And so one of the things that I tell myself all the time is, I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing this for 2 generations down the road. That is probably going to take that long, because we're living in a social system that's existed for a really long time, and it's reproduced itself over and over again. So to change that is going to take time. And that's okay. You know, when I think about my research world, you know, nurture oceanography, coastal change, I mean, we've been working on this. I mean, the Egyptians put in the first breakwaters, right? And I don't seem to mind that progress is slow. I'm still sort of rejoicing in every single discovery that we're making along the way. We've made a lot of progress. So I think it's okay to, you know, we're making progress. Sometimes it's slow, sometimes it's fast, but we just have to keep going. And in a sense, you know, as academics, I think we're pretty dogged, you know, we'll just keep working on a problem. If we just take this on as our problem and keep working on it, we'll make a lot of progress. But it is slow.
Hi, Tuba. Thank you so much for your talk. Speaking from more of a graduate student perspective, are there any ways in which you've seen graduate students make a lasting impact when our position ultimately is temporary?
Yes, absolutely. So this notion of working within your circle of influence is a really powerful one. And graduate students, too, have a circle of influence. So within my college, the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences, we have a small but powerful group of students from underrepresented groups, you know, students of color. And they, about 2 years ago, decided we got to do something. You know, we can't just wait for the professors to do something. And they formed a group that they called the Unpacking Diversity Professional Learning Community. And they started pulling in about once every 6 weeks or so speakers from across campus at first. Then they started raising money and they started bringing in folks from the outside. And so when they bring in a speaker, at first, the first one that I went to every one of them. First one I went to, there were 12 people there, 2 faculty members, including me. But word got out, right? Interesting conversations were being had, hallway conversations. Next thing you know, the second one had much more attendance. The third one had much more attendance. They're now towards the end of their second year, and they get audiences of 60 people and more, many of them faculty. So they were able to really extend their circle of influence, and they're getting bolder with the topics that they're covering. You know, much less, much bolder in the way they're talking about their experiences on campus. And, you know, in the beginning, I think they didn't feel empowered to do this. Now, partially you might think, but wait a minute, is this a physical oceanography student, and why is this person engaging in this work? Shouldn't they be doing their research? One of the things that one of the students, Ale, told me is that she actually felt really empowered by this work. That even though it takes time away from her research, it also makes her a more confident researcher in ways that she really wasn't before, because she's realizing, you know, all of the self-doubt that she had, you know, imposter syndrome and whatnot, it's really the system is set up in a way that makes things difficult for her. It's not that she's weaker than others, right? That self-recognition went a long way for her. And so the students have really benefited from it too. But again, the key has been to work within their circle of influence, do things that they, you know, within their power.